Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our services, if we can please kindly turn off all cell phones or electronic devices, or please place them on silent. Thank you.
Welcome. I ask the immediate family to please rise. We begin our time together this afternoon in loving memory of Glen Hoffing with the tearing of Korea. This loss weighs heavy, and the tearing of the Korea ribbon is symbolic of the terror that we feel on the inside. We say a bracha, a blessing, acknowledging God as the true judge, a sign of submission to this painful reality. I'm going to recite the blessing word by word. I'll say Baruch. You recite. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Dayan Ha'emet. Amen. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, rule the universe, who is the true judge. Adonai Natan, Adonai Lakach, Yishem Adonai Mevorach. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Praise be God's name forever. You may care for yourself or for one another. Easy from the bottom up. You may be seated. Glen Hoffing was a loving husband, a caring father, and a committed congregant. He adored his children. You know, over the last few days and weeks, as Eileen and the kids have posted pictures of Glen, you get the sense that he was at his happiest with them, beaming to be with his family, knowing that he found fulfillment in those close relationships. And over the past week plus, as he transitioned home for his final days, I believe with full faith that I saw that he took comfort in being surrounded by his family. And it was a covet, an honor, a kavod for him to be able to feel the intensity of that love during that very intense time. And today, we all gather together to remember our friend Glen Hoffing, Gershon ben Abraham Besara Zichrono Livracha, of blessed memory. I'm Rabbi Nathan Weiner, the rabbi at Congregation Beth Tikva in Marlton, where the family has made their spiritual home, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, our Rabbi Emeritus, Rabbi Gary Gans, whom you'll hear from shortly. It's an honor on behalf of myself, Sam, my family, and the entire congregation, I see we have the whole section here, to be here with you all to honor Glen's life. And I mentioned my family there because we all traveled to Israel together last February, just before COVID hit. Congregation Beth Tikva and Prince of Peace Lutheran Church put together this joint trip, and my family decided to come along, and so did Glen. And he had been battling illness for a long time, and we weren't sure if he was going to come, and he did. He wasn't going to let any illness stop him from taking this journey. And journey he did. Yeah, I always have found Glen to be quietly yet deeply inquisitive, certainly unafraid to challenge ideology. And on this trip, I specifically remember, I mentioned this to you, a conversation I had with him in Nazareth. When we got off the bus, he approached me. We were walking from the bus up the hill to the Annunciation Church, and on the bus I had spent time speaking about Israeli Arabs and Jewish and Arab coexistence in the north of Israel, and I don't remember exactly what I said, but maybe you've had this experience too. Glen pulled up next to me in his soft-spoken, gentle, but coy way. He said, "You know, Rabbi, you said something that sounded a bit more conservative than what I'm used to hearing from you. Let's talk about that." Because he loved to yutz me, and I'm sure some of you too, I'm sure. But during that conversation, we walked and talked and found true common ground, and our relationship deepened during that walk, expanding respect for one another at a time when across difference, that wasn't so common. I'm grateful to have had Glen as a presence on this trip and personally in my life. Our tradition teaches that while the physical body is temporary, the soul is eternal. And we come together today to pray for the full and complete rest for Glen's ailing body, praying that he has found peace after so many years of struggle. We know that his soul is bound to the bond of life to each of you. And we pray for the continued elevation of his beautiful soul. Glen is survived by his loving and devoted wife, Eileen, who was by his side every step of the way. And Eileen, I acknowledge you in the difficult year you had. It wasn't so long ago that so many of us stood together at your father's funeral, Louis Gazen of blessed memory. None of us can know your pain, but we can all walk the path with you. As I say, you've got some broad shoulders. You are held and you're loved along with Glen's children. His son Ed, his daughter Rachel and her partner Matt, Daniel and your wife Emily, Stephen. May your love, I flip-flopped. Stephen and your wife Emily. Sorry, Daniel. Mazel tov, right? May your love for one another truly carry you through this difficult transition. I turn the mic over to Rabbi Gans.
This is indeed a sad day. On the macro level, today is the 17th of Tammuz, a mourning day when the Romans preparing to breach the walls of Jerusalem had their first entry into what would ultimately be the fall of the city itself. On a micro level, cancer has breached the walls of the Hoffing family. This too led to his ultimate fall and demise. Yet I have been with you for a long time. We celebrated joys and trips and celebrations and sadnesses along the way. I hope that in the ultimate balance of life, the joys more than make up for the weight that we share of the sadnesses. I did a search on my computer last night. I'm not good at deleting messages. And I found a slew of email from Glen that dates back 5 and 6 years. There are two kinds of emails. There are political positions, the points that he didn't like what I had said or thought, or somehow put words in my mouth supporting progressive candidates that we hadn't even spoken about. And there were emails about his illness, his remission, and the times that he was concerned for his health and for his family. These emails date back more than 6, 7 years. And I can see a steady progression, perhaps digression, over the course of time about his feelings. We never did agree politically. We agreed at best to disagree if we would approach the subjects at all. But it was the subjects about you, his family, and his personal feelings that were predominant, that are the most meaningful for me. Because they pointed out his resilience, his ultimate battle with life, for life. He didn't want to just turn away and give up. Not politically, and not in terms of his own personal health. And he never, ever gave up on you. And these were expressed through these texts and through his missives that he would send to me, often late at night, that I would read upon awakening in the morning. I said, oh, Glen's there again. But it is that strength of and will of character that propelled him. Yeah, he was sick for a long time, over the course of years. And other people might have said, "Gnig, enough." And we certainly would have said, "We get it. We understand." But he kept up the battle as long as he could. And even when we saw him last week, after you brought him home, and saw that with hospice you continued to treat him as a mensch, he returned home to spend his last days in the familiar setting, surrounded by family, surrounded by a familiar place, and a sense that his life was well lived. And you acknowledged the kadosh, the holiness in his life that he represented. You never faltered in his support. I believe that he knew and that he heard you, even if it didn't sound like, or he couldn't respond verbally. He was aware of your presence. And I was honored to be part of the extended family last week when Rabbi Nathan and I were there and offered prayers on his behalf. Not expecting that our prayers would suddenly provide a miracle for his health, but we hoped, we anticipated that our presence would be important for his transition and for yours. And I would suggest that just as he was resilient, his hope is that you too will feel that same inner strength and power, and equally be resilient as you can while still remembering him. It is okay to be sad and somehow to compartmentalize all that he represents. I've chosen to share with you a prayer. A number of you from the congregation over the many years have heard me say this following prayer from this very pulpit, even for my own family. I still find a great deal of meaning from these words of Ben Sirach that I will translate and read for you in the English as they echo for me through the eons. And he wrote, "We are all destined to die. We share with all who ever lived, with all who ever will be. Cry for the dead. Hide not your grief. Do not restrain your mourning. But remember that continuing sorrow is worse than death. When the dead are at rest, let their memory be a source of peace, and be consoled when the soul departs. Death ultimately is better than a life of pain, and eternal rest is better than lingering illness. As a drop of water in the sea, as a grain of sand on the shore, are our few days in eternity. The good things in life last for a short time, but a good name, a good reputation endures forever." I'm honored to call a number of speakers who will remind us of his goodness, of his good name, and of their relationship. I call first on Rachel.
It's hard for me to sum up 25 years of love, support, and memories of my dad into just a few minutes, but I'll try. From a young age, Dad always inspired me to learn, and he was always the first person I would go to. I have many, many memories of him sitting at the kitchen table after family dinners, from learning my times tables and spelling in elementary school, to SAT vocab and calculus in high school. Dad was always there. He'd quiz me on country capitals in the car and algebra in the grocery store checkout. He liked to watch me figure things out, and took great pride in what he could teach. And as I got older and my interest in education began to form and to specialize, he was always thrilled to let me return the joy of teaching. As many of you know, Dad loved to argue and to debate. there's a central tenet of Glen Hoffing, it would certainly contain at least two things. Wawa Italian hoagies, and the desire to argue everything and anything at all. As a teenager, I remember a handful of long arguments with Dad, after hours of ruthless back and forths. And cite this and cite that, Dad would admit to have agreed with me the whole time. His goal, he said, was to see how well I could back up my own points, my own opinions, and my own ideas. Dad was never the type of guy to let me get off easy with something like that. Even when we disagreed, Dad always wanted to know what I thought first. He would hear me out, every time, fully. He would patiently heed my points, agree where he could, before he would absolutely and mercilessly explain to me why I was wrong on every single account. Dad was firm in his beliefs, but not rigid. He was always open to having his mind changed and took every opportunity to do so, but admittedly it was a very high bar. Regardless, we would always find a way to find common ground. Several years ago, after a major weight loss, Dad found a new hold and approach on life. He entered a new era that I like to affectionately call Fashion Dad. He ditched his old wardrobe, replaced it with clean-cut shirts and slacks, wool sweaters, and high-end vintage shoes. If that doesn't sound like Dad, to clear it up, absolutely all of it, every single item was thrifted and bargained for. Even more than oatmeal cookies, the Houston Astros, or Mercedes-Benz cars, Dad loved a good deal. Fashion Dad led way to what today I'd call Adventure Dad. Dad was the fittest he'd ever been, and suddenly he wanted to do it all. He wanted to travel the world. Just last year, he traveled to Israel, something he had always hoped to do throughout his life. Our family was lucky to travel to Croatia and Spain together. Dad and I and my partner Matt took our own trip to Iceland too. On one day of that trip, Dad took us to a very precarious hiking route. There was trudging through snow, a river crossing on a very questionably maintained bridge, and what looked to be like a completely vertical uphill trek along a cliff. On that day, the river crossing had been blocked off. I was silently very relieved to not have to watch my dad dangerously walk along a steep cliff. He, however, on that day, walked away brainstorming when he would manage to find the time to return so he could finish that hike. If Dad set his mind to something, he was determined to finish it. Dad was an incredibly bright, snarky, and quick-witted guy. He loved his family and always looked forward to spending time with us. Whether it was huddled around the fire in the backyard, seated at the kitchen table playing late-night board games, or showing us his garden, and of course, taking a moment to go on about the deer that would eat his hostas year after year after year. He loved jazz and classic rock, his dogs, and of course, above all, his family. He took great pride in the life he built, but even more in the life and accomplishments of his children. Dad was never a complainer. He never allowed his illness to affect his attitude on life. Even in the last few years, as the medications he took burdened him with uncomfortable and difficult side effects, he stayed positive, only ever mentioning an issue if it was truly necessary. And even just a few weeks ago, when I would visit him in the hospital and ask how he was doing, he'd say, "Pretty good." And he'd go right back to asking me how I was. And on the worst days we had, Dad was calm and comforting, always reaching out to hold my hand when I needed it. Dad was a strong man. I feel very lucky to have had him as my mentor, my guide and my rock for all these years. I will miss him profoundly and with every piece of me. Thank you.
Rachel mentioned the board games, and I was very impressed when you mentioned that even last week he was still playing with you. Choo.
Ticket to Ride.
What's it called?
Ticket to Ride.
Ticket to
He was
Ride.
playing in his room.
So even in Tibet, you still played with a game with him, and he appreciated it. I never heard of this game, but I'm sure it was meaningful. I'm not honored to call on Eileen.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. While I look through Glen's very organized files, I happened upon an article tucked into his Social Security file. The title of the article was, "I Want to Burden My Loved Ones." The author had been to a workshop on advanced directives. After listening to many speakers, he decided that he did not want to put his wishes into an advanced directive. The author's argument was that in a family, we cared for each other. We often are asked to do things for each other that may feel like a burden. He went on to say that morality in large part consists of learning to deal with the unwanted and unexpected interruptions to our plans. The author said that writing down his wishes in an advance directive would help him to unburden his family when the end-of-life decisions had to be made. However, he said his family would be making decisions based on what he wrote in his advance directives at an earlier time. By not having an advance directive, his family would have to come together to make these difficult decisions. Glen did not have a living will. When we talked about it, he refused. He was a stubborn man. Now looking back, I believe his decision was made after he read this and probably many other articles like this. As a family, we were faced with these questions, amongst others. Did we want to intubate? Did we want him to receive CPR? As we discussed these and many other such questions that were posed to us, I realized that Glen gave us the gift of making these decisions, not based on what he would have wanted, but on what was right for him at that point in his illness. We made what I believe to be the best decisions based on our intense love and respect for him as our husband and father, and have no regrets. We brought Glen home on hospice a little over a week ago. He was so happy to be home with all of us. He succumbed quickly to his brain infection, but was comfortable at home. He passed away on Thursday with his family and our love surrounding him. I'll miss our life. Ours was a great adventure. We geocached and we traveled. We geocached while we traveled. We visited beautiful seaports and faraway lands, synagogues, churches, and mosques. We ate in outdoor cafes in Spain and Croatia, and our favorite place was deep in the Wharton Forest, where there wasn't a soul around for miles. Amidst his funny, quirky comments, his incredible intelligence and kindness, Glen was a good man. He loved his immediate family and the parts of his family that extended into other homes and lives. He was loved by many. His passing has left a huge hole in my heart.
I think you referenced the gift of decision-making that Glen left with you. You also gave him a gift of how you created his comfort and height of care. Now call on Steve.
So, before my father died, while he was in the neural ICU at the hospital, we all met with his oncologist, Dr. Brose. We were sequestered into a small patient consultation room off to the side. Splattered on the walls were some nice paintings and fancy glass bowls. We sat around a table in the center of the room, flanked by a couch towards the door, and, confusingly, a landline phone towards the back that would ring frequently, interrupting our trains of thought. I hadn't met Dr. Brose at this point, but she made it clear that she had been working with my dad for a very long time. 8 years ago, she started him on a regimen of experimental drugs to address his thyroid cancer that had returned. 8 years ago, unbeknownst to me and my siblings, until just a few weeks ago, my dad had only 2 years to live. I am grateful that my parents kept this from us. The timing of this revelation in the hospital was ideal for me, coinciding with the understanding of my father's imminent death crystallizing in my head. I learned that Dr. Brose's treatment granted him an incredibly vibrant 6 more years of life. During that time, I graduated college and started my career. Our family took 2 trips to Europe. My dad discovered an interest in board games beyond Monopoly and Risk. He left his job and entered retirement, and just this past April, I got married to my long-term partner, Emily. With this new knowledge about my father's treatment, I was able to transform a piece of my despair about his life being cut short into an appreciation of and gratitude for those 6 years that he had been granted. Dr. Brose said that he was one of her best patients, He responded very well to the drugs. She told me he was a vital part of her research and featured prominently in her papers. And just a few weeks before his passing, the drugs received FDA approval. The treatment that worked so well for my father can now go on to help other families in need. And in this way, my dad leaves behind a legacy. Thanks.
Indeed, his concern and your awareness of his legacy will outlive his mortal life because of his participation in that program. Yasher koach to him. We now turn to a series of concluding prayers. The first is called El Malei Rachamim, God the Compassionate One. Even in these intense moments of sadness, we direct ourselves to the power that makes for forgiveness, the power that makes for salvation, and the power of God that gives us a sense of truth in the universe. Rabbi Nathan will read the El Malei Rachamim in Hebrew. That will indeed be using his Hebrew name as well, his Glen's Hebrew name, and I will be offering an English interpretation.
Please rise. El Malei Rachamim Shochen Bamromim Hamitzei Menucha Nechona Al Kanfei Hashchina B'malot Kedoshim U'Tehorim Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim Et Nishmat Gershon Ben Avraham V'Sara Shehalach Le'olamo Ba'avor Shenatvu Tzedakah Ba'ad Haskarat Nishmato V'gan Eden Tehe Menuchato Lachen Bal Harachamim Yastireu B'Setar Kenafav Le'olamim B'tzror Hachayim Et Nishmato Adonai hu nachalato v'yanuach al mishkavo v'shalom v'nomar Amen.
As indeed with Glen, when he chose to be his Hebrew name of Gershon Ben Avraham V'Sara, when he mindfully opted to renew his connection with the Jewish people. O God, exalted and full of compassion, grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence. Among the holy and pure, to the soul of Glen Hoffing, Gershon Ben Avraham V'Sara, who has gone to his eternal home. Master of mercy, we beseech you, remember all the worthy and righteous deeds that he performed in the land of the living. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. The Lord is his portion. May he rest in the tranquility of shalom, of peace. And let us all say, Amen.
You may be seated. Brief announcements. Shiva Minyanim will be taking place at the Hoffing home tonight and tomorrow night with Minyanim at 7:30 p.m. And the family asks that donations in Glen's memory be made to my discretionary fund at Congregation Beth Tikva. Thank you. And also to Samaritan Healthcare and Hospice. We now transition from the mitzvah of kavod hamet, of honoring the deceased, to the mitzvah of nichum avelim, of comforting the mourners. We create a community of love and consolation around them as they provide uplift for Glen's neshama, for his soul, with the first recitation of the mourner's Kaddish. I invite you once again to please rise. Yitgadal, Yitgadash, Shemei Rabbah, V'alma Divra Kirutei, V'amlich Malchutei, B'chayechon Uvyomechon, Uv'chayei D'chol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agala Uv'izman Kariv V'imru, Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevorach, Le'olam U'amei Omaya. Yitvarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shmei v'kudisha b'rihu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiran v'yalma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya V'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'ramav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. May the one who ordains peace in the heavens inspire us to be God's partners for peace on earth, for us, for all Israel and all inhabitants of the earth. And let us say, Amen. You may be seated once again.
I would ask you to rise once more, please.
Adonai, mi yagur ohelecha, mi yishkon bahar kodshecha, olech tamim lefoel tzedek, v'dover emet b'lavavo, lo ragal al leshono, lo asa l're'ehu ra'a, v'cherpa lo nasa al klovo, nivze b'einav nim'as, v'et yired Adonai yichabed, נשפל הרב לא ימיר, כספו לא נתן בנשך, ושוחד ענקי לא לקח. עושה אלה, לא ימות לעולם.
If you'll be seated, please. Ladies and gentlemen, I would ask that you kindly remain seated. This way, please. Just right at the front. This way, please.